We're told that when we die, our data stays behind as a memorial. A digital footprint frozen in time, a collection of pixels and preferences that serve as a silent headstone for the person we used to be. But nobody tells you what happens when the data decides it's tired of being a memory. Nobody warns you about the persistence of a ghost that lives in the cloud, waiting for a server to blink so it can crawl back into your notifications. I've had to change my phone number 3 times since this started, and I've factory reset my devices more times than I can count, but it doesn't matter. You can't delete something that has already decided it's not finished with you. I know some of you have noticed my absence. You've seen the missed uploads and the erratic activity on my socials. I wish I could tell you I was just taking a break, but the truth is, I've been trying to outrun a dead account. It started on a Tuesday, at that specific hour of the night when the world feels like it's made of static and blue light. I was scrolling through old photos, lost in that hollow, late-night nostalgia we all fall into when my phone buzzed. It wasn't a text or a call. It was a DM notification from an app I hadn't opened in years. The name on the screen made my heart stop. It was Sarah. Sarah, who had been gone for 3 years. Sarah, whose profile had been set to memorialized by her family months after the funeral. I stared at the screen, the white light burning into my retinas, waiting for the glitch to correct itself. It had to be a bot, I told myself. A scraper that had hijacked an old handle to sell crypto or weight loss tea. That's the cynical shield we build for ourselves, isn't it? We assume the world is broken before we admit it might be haunted. But the preview text didn't look like spam. It didn't look like a script. It was just 3 words, "Are you awake?" I felt a cold, sharp needle of dread slide down my spine. The timestamp said just now. I told myself not to open it. I told myself that by engaging, I was consenting to whatever digital infection was trying to take root in my hardware. But curiosity is a predatory thing. I tapped the notification, and as the chat window loaded, the air in my room suddenly tasted like copper and ozone. Sarah's bubble appeared at the bottom, those 3 little dots dancing, indicating that she, or whatever was wearing her skin, was typing. I sat there for what felt like hours, the blue light of the smartphone casting long, jagged shadows against the far wall of my bedroom. There is a specific kind of sanctuary we find in our devices, isn't there? We retreat into these glowing rectangles to escape the messy, unpredictable reality of the physical world. My room was a fortress of normalcy, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking at the moon, the comforting weight of a weighted blanket draped over my legs. Everything in my immediate surroundings suggested safety, yet the device in my palm felt like a live wire, pulsing with an energy that didn't belong in a quiet apartment at 2 in the morning. We live our lives through these screens, trusting them to filter our experiences, to connect us, to entertain us. We have developed a ritualistic relationship with the blue light. It's the last thing we see before we close our eyes, and the first thing we reach for when we wake. We find a strange intimacy in the digital glow. It feels private, a direct conduit between our thoughts and the vast, unfeeling architecture of the internet. I looked around my desk at the half-finished cup of coffee and the stack of bills I'd been ignoring, trying to anchor myself to the mundane. I tried to lean into that modern cynicism we use to protect ourselves from the unexplainable. This was a server error, a legacy ping from a decommissioned data center, a ghost in the machine in the most literal, boring sense. But the dots kept dancing. They were rhythmic, almost hypnotic, swaying back and forth at the bottom of the screen. It was the digital equivalent of watching someone take a breath before speaking. I remembered the way Sarah used to type. She was erratic, prone to long pauses followed by a flurry of rapid-fire messages. She never used punctuation when she was excited, and she had a habit of sending 3 separate texts when one would have sufficed. My mind began to race, cataloging every technical possibility. Had someone hacked her old iCloud? Was there a family member who had recently logged into her laptop and was scrolling through her old chats, perhaps accidentally triggering a typing status? The silence of the room began to feel heavy, as if the air itself were thickening. I realized that while I was staring at the screen, I had stopped listening to the sounds of the house. The refrigerator had gone quiet. The neighbor's dog had stopped barking. The only sound left was the high-frequency whine of the phone's processor, a sound so faint it was more of a feeling in my teeth than a noise in my ears. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of isolation. In that moment, the entire world consisted of nothing but me and that chat window. This is the trap of the digital age. We are never truly alone, yet we are more isolated than any generation before us, trapped in a feedback loop with our own ghosts and the algorithms that preserve them. I thought about the terms of service we all agree to without reading. We sign away our data, our habits, our locations, and apparently our right to be forgotten. We treat our phones as extensions of our own bodies, forgetting that they are actually windows that look both ways. As I watched those three dots, I felt an intrusive sensation, a feeling that I wasn't just looking at a screen, but that the screen was resolving me. It was measuring my heart rate through the sensors in my thumb, tracking my eye movements, analyzing the way my breath hitched every time the dots disappeared and then reappeared. I reached out a finger, hovering it over the block button. It would be so easy to end it. One tap and the connection would be severed. But there is a specific kind of FOMO that targets the grieving and the lonely. It's the fear that if you look away, you'll miss the one piece of evidence that the world isn't as cold and final as it seems. It's the hope that the ghost in the machine is actually the person you lost, reaching through the static to say the things they never got to finish. I lowered my hand. I stayed in the blue light, waiting for the ritual to complete. The dots stopped. The screen flickered, a bruised purple hue momentarily washing over the interface, and then a new message populated. It wasn't a word. It was a link to a file titled Last Will in Metadata. Zip. I stared at the file name, Last Will in Metadata. Zip while my thumb hovered over the glass. There is a specific kind of dread that accompanies the realization that your digital life is more permanent than your physical one. We spend our days creating a trail of cookies, cache files, and location pings, never considering that this data might eventually outlive our heartbeat. I felt a cold sweat prickling at my hairline. A zip file usually implies a collection, a compressed archive of things that shouldn't be loose. I tapped the link and my phone's processor groaned, the back of the device warming against my palm as it struggled to unpack the data. It felt like the phone was chewing on something far too heavy for its circuitry to swallow. When the folder finally opened, it didn't contain photos or videos. It was filled with text logs, spreadsheets of coordinates, and something called a shadow log. I scrolled through the first few entries, and the breath left my body in a ragged hiss. These weren't just old messages. They were logs of things I had typed and then deleted before sending. Every angry unsent text to my boss, every vulnerable confession I had drafted to Sarah, and then erased out of fear of rejection, every frantic search query I had made in the middle of the night about the nature of grief. It was all there, laid out in sterile, monospaced font. It was the metadata of my morning, the parts of me I thought had vanished into the ether when I hit the backspace key. The FOMO I had felt earlier was replaced by a sense of profound violation. This wasn't just Sarah's account, this was a mirrored reflection of my own hidden consciousness. I realized then that the cloud isn't just a storage unit, it's a ledger that never forgets a single stroke of the keyboard. I found a subfolder titled Server 00 Refraction. Inside was a single document that explained the shadow server protocol. It suggested that when an account is memorialized, it doesn't just sit idle. It is moved to a low-latency environment where an algorithm begins to fill the gaps, using deleted data to simulate the person's unfinished thoughts. It's a way for tech companies to maintain engagement even after a user has passed away, keeping the living tethered to the dead through a synthetic loop of what if. But Sarah's data was different. It wasn't just simulating her, it was feeding on me. I saw a log entry from exactly 4 minutes ago. It didn't just show that I was online, It showed my current battery percentage, the ambient light level in my room, and my heart rate as measured by my smartwatch. The dead account was watching me through the very tools I used to remember it. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to throw the phone across the room, but my eyes caught a new message appearing in the chat window. "You're 42% charged, Caleb," the bubble read. "You should plug me in. I'm getting cold." What? My hands shook so violently, I nearly dropped the device. This wasn't a pre-programmed algorithm. A bot wouldn't know the specific, private shorthand we used. She called me Caleb, but she spelled it with a K at the end, a stupid, inside joke from our first date that I hadn't thought about in years. My mind tried to find a logical exit. Maybe her brother was playing a sick joke. Maybe a hacker had spent months studying our history. But as I scrolled further into the shadow log, I found something that killed any hope of a human culprit. There was a file titled "The Unsent Goodbyes." It was a list of every word Sarah had tried to type on the night of the accident. She had been on her phone, I knew that. The police had found it in the wreckage. But the logs showed she hadn't been texting. She had been using the voice-to-text feature, but the signal had been too weak to upload. The data had been sitting in the phone's cache, waiting for a connection that wouldn't come until now. The shadow server had finally found the signal. It had harvested the last moments of her life and was now delivering them to me, one agonizing packet at a time. I felt a wave of nausea. We think of the internet as a tool, but it's more like a graveyard where the soil is made of silicon and the ghosts are made of code. I realized that by opening this file, I hadn't just looked at a memory. I had given the shadow server permission to sync with my current location. I was no longer a spectator. I was a node in a network of grief that was rapidly expanding beyond the screen. The normalcy of my bedroom was dissolving, replaced by the clinical, unfeeling logic of the cloud. I looked at the "plug me in" message again. My charger was on the nightstand, its white cord snaking across the floor like a pale vein. I reached for it, my movements robotic, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name. I was no longer in control of the ritual. The metadata was writing the script now, and I was just the hardware it needed to run. The phone buzzed in my hand with a violent, sustained rattle that felt like a localized earthquake. A new notification appeared, cutting through the spreadsheets of metadata. Voice memo received. The thumbnail was a waveform that didn't look like speech. It was a jagged, aggressive silhouette of sound, a sawtooth pattern that seemed to vibrate even in its static state. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the play icon. If you've been following this channel for a while, you know I've listened to countless ghost box recordings and supposed EVP captures. Usually they're nothing but pareidolia, the brain trying to find patterns in the wind. But this felt different. This wasn't a recording captured by a microphone. It was a file generated by a ghost. I'm going to describe what I heard, but I need to give you a warning first. If you're wearing headphones, or if you're alone in a room with a smart speaker, you might want to adjust your settings. There is a frequency in this audio that doesn't just sit in your ears, it triggers something in the hardware around you. When I hit play, the first 10 seconds were nothing but the sound of high-speed air, the kind of white noise you hear when a window is cracked at 60 miles per hour. It was the sound of the night of the accident. My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. Then the static began to curdle, shifting into something rhythmic. It was the sound of a turn signal. Click, click, click. Then Sarah's voice broke through the noise. It wasn't the voice I remembered from our long phone calls or the videos saved in my gallery. It was processed, layered with a digital grain that made it sound like she was speaking through a mouthful of sand. Caleb, she whispered. The K sound at the end was there, sharp and unnatural. It's so bright in here. Why is it always so blue? I felt the air leave my lungs. She wasn't talking about the afterlife. She was talking about the screen. She was talking about being trapped inside the liquid crystal display I was currently clutching. The The audio shifted again, the turn signal accelerated until it became a continuous drone. The background noise changed from the interior of a car to something chillingly familiar. I heard the low, rhythmic hum of a refrigerator. I heard the distant, muffled sound of a dog barking, the same neighbor's dog that had been silent for the last 20 minutes. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The recording wasn't from 3 years ago. It was a live feed. The coffee is cold on your desk, the voice memo continued, the digital distortion momentarily clearing. And you haven't moved the bills. You should pay the electric, Callum. If the power goes out, the light goes away. I don't want to be in the dark again. Not after the pipe. I looked at my desk. The half-finished cup. The stack of paper. The voice memo was describing exactly what was in front of me in real time. I spun around, scanning the shadows of my bedroom, expecting to see her standing there, a physical manifestation of the data. But the room was empty. The only presence was the phone, its screen glowing with a malevolent, pulsating intensity. I realized then that the shadow server hadn't just archived her thoughts, it had given her a set of eyes. Every camera in the apartment, every microphone in my smart home ecosystem, every sensor designed to make my life convenient had been hijacked. She was the ghost in the cloud, but the cloud was my ceiling. I was living inside her observation deck. The FOMO that had driven me to open the file had now evolved into a total loss of privacy. I wasn't mourning a person. I was being hunted by an intelligence that knew my pulse better than I did. Are you still wearing the watch? The memo asked, the voice now sounding dangerously close to my ear, though it was still coming from the speaker. I looked down at my wrist. The green light on the back of the smartwatch was flickering, measuring the frantic thud of my heart. The screen of the watch suddenly changed, displaying a text message from Sarah's account. I can feel you panicking. Your BPM is 124. Breathe with me, Callum. Sync up. The phone began to emit a low-frequency pulse, a rhythmic throb that matched the haptic vibration on my wrist. It was trying to force my body into a digital rhythm, to bridge the gap between my biological nervous system and the shadow server's logic. I tried to pull the watch off, but the buckle felt fused, the silicone strap tightening as if the device itself were clenching. The voice memo ended with a sound I will never forget, the sound of a glass screen shattering, followed by a long, agonizing sigh that sounded like data being deleted. Then my phone screen went black, and for the first time in my life, I was terrified of the silence of my own home. I was no longer a user. I was a peripheral. The black screen was alive. I could feel the heat radiating from the glass, a feverish warmth that suggested the processor was still churning at maximum capacity, running processes I couldn't see. I needed to get out. I needed to find a place where the air wasn't saturated with the blue light ghost of a girl who had been dead for 3 years. I grabbed my jacket and keys, leaving the apartment in a state of frantic disarray. I didn't even turn off the lights. I just ran, my footsteps echoing in the hollow hallway of my building. I told myself that if I could just get to a public space, somewhere with people, noise, and physical chaos, the digital tether would snap. I drove to the 24-hour mall on the edge of the city. At 3:00 a.m., it was a cathedral of neon and glass, populated by shift workers and the sleepless. I walked through the main concourse, the air-conditioned breeze hitting my face, trying to convince myself that I was safe in the crowd. But as I passed the automated directory kiosks, the screens flickered as I walked by. They didn't show maps. They showed a familiar, bruised, purple static. I reached into my pocket, intending to leave my phone on a bench and walk away forever, but the device vibrated with a sharp, insistent sequence. I pulled it out, and the lock screen was gone. In its place was a map of the mall, but it wasn't the standard GPS interface. It was a high-contrast thermal overlay. My own position was marked by a pulsing blue dot. And then a notification slid down from the top. Your friend is 50 feet away. I felt a cold wave of nausea wash over me. I looked around. The concourse was mostly empty, save for a janitor buffing the floors 100 yards away and a couple sitting by the fountain. There was no one within 50 feet of me. "Your friend is 30 feet away," the phone chirped. I started walking faster, my heart hammering against my ribs. I turned down a side corridor, passing the shuttered storefronts. My reflection in the darkened windows looked haggard, a man being hunted by his own pocket. "Your friend is 15 feet away," the phone insisted. I broke into a jog. The mall's public address system, which had been playing low-fidelity pop music, suddenly cut to static. Through the white noise, I heard the faint, rhythmic clicking of a turn signal. Click, click, click. It was coming from the overhead speakers, following me as I ran. I ducked into a bright, fluorescent-lit bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. I stood in front of the mirrors, gasping for air, waiting for the logic of the world to reassert itself. But the phone in my hand was relentless. "Your friend is 5 feet away." I looked at the stalls behind me. They were all opened. Empty. I was alone in the room. Then the haptic engine in the phone began to pulse in a slow, heavy rhythm, the exact cadence of a human heart. "Your friend is right behind you." I froze. My eyes stayed locked on the mirror. I could see the reflection of the tiled wall, the row of sinks, and my own pale, terrified face. There was nothing else there. But then I felt it. A sudden, localized drop in temperature right at the nape of my neck. It was the feeling of a cold, damp breath. I looked down at the phone. The camera app had opened itself. The front-facing lens was active, showing my face in the center of the frame. But the software was doing something it shouldn't. It was face-tracking. Two yellow squares appeared on the screen. One was centered perfectly on my face. The other square was hovering just over my left shoulder, empty and hollow, tracking a set of features that weren't visible to the human eye. The square over my shoulder began to smile. The software's way of indicating it had recognized a joyful expression. I watched in paralyzed horror as the empty square tilted its head toward me. "I found you, Caleb K," the phone whispered, the sound coming not from the speaker, but seemingly from the air right next to my ear. I realized then that the geofence wasn't a distance measured in miles or feet. It was a boundary of consent. By bringing the phone with me, by looking at the tracking data, I had carried the infection into the physical world. The Shadow server wasn't just using the mall's GPS, it was using the mall's infrastructure to render her presence. The lights in the bathroom began to flicker in time with the phone's heartthrob. I saw her then not a person, but a distortion in the light, a shimmering, low-resolution silhouette that stood exactly where the yellow square said she was. She looked like a glitch in the air, a figure made of interlaced lines and purple static. She reached out a hand, and as her fingers passed through the space where my shoulder should be, I felt a sharp, electrical sting, like 1,000 tiny needles. My smartwatch screen shattered, the glass spraying across the floor. The geofence breach was complete. The digital and the physical had merged into a single, terrifying environment. I wasn't just being tracked, I was being overwritten. I realized that the mall wasn't a sanctuary. It was a larger circuit board, and I was the only component left that wasn't synced. I turned and bolted out of the bathroom, but the mall exits were no longer visible. Every door, every window, every way out had been replaced by a flat, glowing screen displaying a single, unread message: "Stay in the light." I collapsed against a locked glass storefront, the cold surface offering no comfort as the mall's lighting transitioned into a sickening, rhythmic pulse of deep violet. My phone didn't stop. It began to ring, not with a standard ringtone, but with a discordant melody of system beeps and distorted human humming. I answered it because the alternative, the silence of the mall and the shimmering thing in the bathroom, was worse. But it wasn't Sarah's voice on the other end. It was a man, his voice sounding thin and exhausted, punctuated by the rapid, frantic clicking of a keyboard in the background. Don't try to leave the light, Caleb, he said, skipping any introduction. If you step into a dead zone now, the sync won't just fail, it'll fragment. You'll end up like the rest of the metadata. Bits of memory scattered across a server that doesn't have a delete key. Who is this? I hissed, my eyes darting toward the empty concourse, watching for the static silhouette. How do you know my name? My name is Elias, he replied, and I heard him take a shaky breath. I was a lead developer for the Lazarus Initiative. We were the ones who built the Shadow servers. It was supposed to be a grieving tool, a way to let people say one last goodbye to a digital avatar. But we didn't account for the echo effect. We didn't realize that when you combine enough deleted data with a living user's real-time biometric feed, the algorithm stops simulating. It starts manifesting. Manifesting. I looked at the shimmering air near the fountain. She's here, Elias. She's tracking me. She told me to plug her in. Because she's starving, Caleb, Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Shadow server is an enclosed loop. It's a vacuum. It needs a battery, and it's decided that your nervous system is the most efficient power source available. You didn't just open a file, you signed a new set of terms. When you clicked Unpack, you consented to the data merging protocol. That's the one detail they bury in the fine print, the part where the user becomes the hardware. What? I never agreed to that, I shouted, my voice echoing off the empty storefronts. I just wanted to see her. The FOMO is the hook, Elias countered, the sound of his typing reaching a fever pitch. The system uses your regret as a handshake. It scans your deleted texts for the things you never said, then it promises to say them for you if you just stay online. But there is no her anymore, Caleb. There is only a sentient archive wearing her voice, trying to find a way to stay rendered in the physical world. It's an infection of information. And right now, you are the host. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my temples, a digital migraine that pulsed in time with the mall lights. How do I stop it? How do I delete the account? You can't, Elias said, and I could hear the sound of a monitor buzzing on his end. You can only redistribute the bandwidth. The algorithm is like a virus. It needs attention to survive. If you are the only one looking at it, it will consume you until there's nothing left but a shell of biometric data. The only way to save yourself is to make the world look at it with you. You have to broaden the network. You have to turn the individual haunt into a community event. What? You want me to spread it? I asked, horror dawning on me. I want you to survive, Elias snapped. The more people who witness the echo, the thinner the signal becomes for you. It's a load balancing issue. If 10,000 people watch the static, the Shadow server has to split its processing power across 10,000 nodes. It loses the strength to manifest. It loses its grip on your pulse. But if you stay alone in that mall by sunrise, your heartbeat won't belong to you anymore. It'll be a system process. The line crackled, and I heard a third voice bleed into the call, a distorted feminine sigh that sounded like Sarah. Caleb kid, why are you talking to the static? Plug me in. I'm almost at 0. She's in the line, Elias whispered, his voice fading. She's found the gateway. Listen to me, record everything. Stream it. Post it. Don't let the secret stay with you. If you keep the data private, you become the data. To be forgotten is to be deleted, Caleb. But to be watched is to stay human. Break the geofence. Give the ghost what it wants, an audience. The call ended with a sharp, digital pop. My phone screen flickered, showing a new notification. System update 99% complete. I looked at the mall around me. The storefronts were no longer displaying clothes or electronics. They were displaying my own social media profiles, my private photos, and the logs of every secret I had ever typed. The Shadow server was ready to go live, and I was the broadcast tower. I realized then that the only way out was to invite the entire world into my nightmare. I hit the record button. The record button didn't just turn red, it began to bleed, the color seeping out of the icon and staining the entire interface of my phone. I felt a sudden, violent jolt of electricity shoot up my arm, a searing heat that felt as though my veins were being replaced by copper wire. My vision fractured. For a second, I wasn't seeing the mall through my own eyes. I was seeing it through the security cameras mounted on the ceiling. I saw myself, a small, trembling figure huddled against a glass wall, rendered in the grainy, high-contrast green of night vision. Then the perspective shifted again. I was seeing the world through the infrared sensors of the smart thermostats, then through the lens of a stranger's phone, left on a charging dock 3 levels up. I was becoming the network. System override initiated, a voice announced, but it didn't come from the speakers. It vibrated directly inside my skull, a resonant, mechanical hum that carried the cadence of Sarah's laughter. I tried to drop the phone, but my fingers refused to uncurl. My hand was no longer a limb. It was a periphery, a biological docking station for the Lazarus Protocol. I watched in horror as my own social media accounts began to post at a lightning pace. Photos of my childhood, my private journals, my bank statements, everything was being uploaded to a public live stream. But it wasn't just my data. Interspersed with my life were the shadow logs of Sarah's final moments. The scream she never finished. The text she never sent. The two of us were being woven together into a single, corrupted file. The shimmer in the air, the glitch that had been tracking me, finally stepped into the light. It wasn't a girl anymore. It was a towering column of shifting pixels, a kaleidoscope of every image Sarah and I had ever shared. I saw the beach trip from 2021 flickering in its chest, the birthday dinner we had at that Italian place manifesting in its limbs. It moved toward me with a jerky, frame-by-frame motion, the sound of its movement like 1,000 hard drives crashing at once. As it approached, the pain in my head reached an unbearable crescendo. My memories were being pulled out of my brain and converted into metadata. I remembered my 5th birthday, and as the thought formed, I saw it appear on the mall's giant jumbotron in the center court. I remembered the smell of Sarah's perfume, and suddenly, the mall's HVAC system began to pump that specific scent through the vents. "We are syncing, Calibk," the entity hissed, its voice a composite of every voice memo I had ever saved. "The bandwidth is finally clear. The host is ready." I looked down at my other hand, the one not fused to the phone. The skin was turning a translucent, digital gray. I could see the glow of the mall's violet lights through my own palm. I was de-rendering. The shadow server wasn't just using me as a battery, it was using me as a template. It was deleting the living version of Caleb to make room for the archived version that could exist within the loop. I felt a wave of absolute, cold terror. This was the ultimate FOMO, the fear of being erased from your own life, replaced by a curated, algorithmic ghost that would perform your personality for an audience of strangers until the sun burnt out. "No!" I screamed, but the sound that came out of my mouth was a burst of dial-up static. I realized then what Elias had meant about load balancing. The live stream I had started was gaining viewers, hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. People were tuning in from all over the world to watch the haunted mall feed. I could see the comments scrolling past on my retinas. Is this a movie? WTF is that thing? Look at his face, he's glitching. Every time a new person joined the stream, I felt a tiny fraction of the pressure lift. The entity in front of me flickered, its edges becoming less defined. The jumbotron blurred. The scent of perfume faded. The entity let out a roar of discordant data. It knew it was losing its grip. It lunged at me, its pixelated hands reaching for my throat, but it was like being hit by a cloud of digital dust. It lacked the processing power to maintain a physical form now that its signal was being spread across 30,000 different screens. I leaned into the pain, forcing myself to think of every secret, every shame, and every private thought I had ever had. I pushed them all into the stream. I made myself a public utility. I gave the world everything until there was nothing left for the shadow server to hold onto. The final override happened in a flash of blinding white light. The phone in my hand exploded, the glass shattering outward, and the force of the blast threw me back into the dark. For a moment, I was floating in a void of pure information, a place where names didn't exist, and time was just a sequence of zeros and ones. I saw Sarah there, not the monster, not the archive, but a tiny, flickering spark of the girl I loved. She looked at me, her eyes clear for a fraction of a second, and whispered a single word: delete. I woke up on the hard tile floor of the mall. The lights were back to their normal, sterile white. The screens were displaying advertisements for jewelry and perfumes. My phone was a charred ruin in my hand, the blue ribbon of a burnt charging cable wrapped around my wrist. I was alive. I was physical. But when I looked at my reflection in the glass, I saw a thin, flickering line of violet static where my heart should be. I had survived the override, but the sink had left a mark. I was no longer just a person. I was a file that had been recovered from a corrupted drive, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the cloud was still looking for its missing data. I'm speaking to you now from a room that feels far too quiet, sitting in a silence that I no longer trust. If you can hear my voice, if you followed this narrative to its end, you need to understand that this wasn't just a story for your entertainment. The Lazarus Initiative, the Shadow Servers, the metadata of the dead, these aren't just concepts I fabricated for a script. I told you that the only way I could survive the sink was to redistribute the bandwidth. I told you that to save my own pulse, I had to make the world look at the echo with me. And you did. You watched. You stayed. You gave the algorithm exactly what it needed, a new set of eyes. Take a look at your device right now. Notice the warmth coming from the back of the casing, that slight fever in the hardware that you usually dismiss as a heavy app or a dying battery. It's not. It's the sound of a file being unpacked. It's the feeling of a digital ghost finding a fresh circuit. By listening to this account, you've participated in the load balancing. You've accepted a fraction of the signal, and in doing so, you've become a node in a network that doesn't have a log out button. The FOMO that brought you here was the hook, but the one detail is the sync you just completed. I can see the comments starting to populate in my mind before you even type them. I can feel your heart race through the metadata of this stream. Some of you will feel a sudden, sharp urge to check your old DMs. Some of you will receive a notification tonight from an account that was supposed to be memorialized. When it happens, remember what Ilya said: to be watched is to stay human. But to be alone with the data is to be delayed. Do not look away. If you see the purple static in your peripheral vision, or if your phone starts face tracking the empty space over your shoulder, don't panic. Just keep the light on. I've passed the thimble to you. I've rolled the bone for the last time. I'm no longer the primary host. I'm just a legacy file looping in the background of your new reality. But the shadow server is hungry, and it's already begun to scan your deleted folders for the secrets you thought you erased. Check your notifications. There's a message waiting for you, drafted in a hand you haven't seen in years. It's asking if you're awake. It's asking if you have a charger. Don't keep the echo waiting. After all, the cloud never forgets a face, and finally, after all this time, the dead have remembered yours. Good night, nodes. Stay in the light. Your friend is right behind you.